They announced her appointment like it was the natural order of things. No context, no buildup, just a slide in the Monday town hall with her name in bold and her title beneath it. Camille Delano, head of people strategy. The name didn't surprise me, the title did. Or rather, the speed with which it appeared on that screen. I stood near the back of the conference room, nodding like everyone else, arms folded loosely, mind fully awake. Camille had joined the company 2 months earlier under the vague designation of strategic partner to the CAO. No role description, no organizational chart entry, just a desk on the top floor, access to executive meetings, and a last name that quietly matched that of Lena Norwick, our new chief administrative officer. No one had said it aloud, but everyone understood. Now it was official. And my role, built over 10 years of designing infrastructure, policy, and trust, had been folded into hers without so much as a conversation. I'm Talia Rivers. Until 3 weeks ago, I led the HR operations for our entire North American business unit. Not with flair, not with headlines, just with precision. I wrote our compliance protocols from the ground up, led post-merger alignment during 2 acquisitions, guided 5 leadership transitions without a single lawsuit. People in the company didn't always see my name, but they always felt the systems I left behind. I didn't campaign. I didn't charm my way into boardrooms. I worked, and I waited. When the company announced it was reimagining people strategy as a more holistic, future-oriented discipline, I welcomed the shift. I submitted a full proposal outlining how we could realign policy with engagement. Lena called it impressive. She scheduled a one-on-one with me the following Monday. That meeting lasted 13 minutes. She complimented my tenure, said I had been a pillar. Then she mentioned Camille, casually, as if the transition was already in motion. She said Camille had a fresh lens, that legacy systems had to make room for flexible leadership. I remember the exact phrasing. "We're not removing what you built. We're simply elevating it through a new narrative." I said nothing, just nodded once, gathered my notes, and left. By that afternoon, Camille had been looped into all standing leadership workflows. I was quietly removed from the strategic planning committee. The org chart was updated. My role title stayed the same, but the dotted lines that once connected me to executive strategy had been erased. The message wasn't subtle. I wasn't being demoted. I was being displaced. Not by performance, but by proximity. I didn't contest the change. I didn't schedule a follow-up. I simply walked back to my desk, locked the door, and opened a folder I hadn't touched in 3 years. It was labeled Governance Red Lines, though inside it was more than just process documents. It contained policy iterations, time-stamped decision trails, legal memos, and a complete audit log of every structural reform I had authored since joining the company. I didn't compile it for defense. I compiled it because I understood early on that organizations don't remember what keeps them standing until it begins to crack. That week, Camille gave her first all-hands message. She spoke about rethinking people as a shared resource, aligning talent fluidity with operational resilience. She talked about rewiring organizational empathy. She mentioned frameworks and rescripting trust. She didn't mention compliance. Didn't mention process integrity. She didn't mention me. I watched the replay from my office, took notes, not because I disagreed, but because I understood what wasn't being said. Camille wasn't dismantling what I built. She was erasing the logic that held it together. And in doing so, she had already stepped onto unstable ground. The real betrayal didn't arrive through announcement. It came in small, intentional omissions. A hiring decision moved forward without my sign-off. A policy deck I authored circulated without my name on the final slide. My access to the compensation modeling tool was downgraded with no explanation. Camille, meanwhile, held office hours twice a week in the executive lounge, where junior analysts were invited to brainstorm cultural recalibration. She posted photos of sticky note walls filled with color-coded buzzwords: inclusion, innovation, intentionality. None of it reflected the hard architecture that had kept the company's people systems stable for a decade. But that didn't matter. The performance was what Lena had banked on. Camille's enthusiasm was being sold as disruption, her lack of historical baggage rebranded as agility. I knew what it really was: proximity over principle. But I also knew that naming it too soon would only reinforce the narrative they were writing about me: experienced, but obsolete. So I let it unfold. My calendar shrank. Meetings I once facilitated were reassigned. When Camille began overseeing onboarding redesign, she asked that I take a step back to observe the flow from a neutral angle. I understood the language, I knew the pattern. I had helped document it in dozens of exit reports from managers who were quietly isolated before being shown the door. I wasn't surprised, but I was taking notes. Every change she made, every new initiative, every rephrased value statement was being tracked against the systems she was now ignoring. Her proposals broke audit chains. Her revised processes lacked escalation logic. She bypassed internal legal on 2 contractor rollouts. Not out of malice, out of ignorance. She simply didn't know what she didn't know, and no one around her was incentivized to slow her down. Lena checked in once, briefly. She framed it as a gesture of continuity, said she appreciated my grace, that the company still valued legacy knowledge, that she hoped I'd see the bigger picture in time. I thanked her for the conversation, and once she left, I flagged the version history of our parental leave policy, where Camille had replaced the word guarantee with flexibility. It was a small change, but it altered the legal threshold for dispute resolution. I logged it, annotated it, then closed the file. There's a particular kind of silence that only long-term employees recognize. It isn't passive, it's strategic. It's the silence of someone who has seen people come and go, watched visions rise and fall, and learned that the most effective form of resistance is not disruption, but endurance. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting a return. I was watching the fault lines form beneath a system that no longer understood what it owed to the people who built its foundation. The new team stopped inviting me to planning huddles. Camille introduced a cross-functional group for culture innovation and gave it a name pulled from a podcast. She assigned a former intern to lead a DEI task force without consulting the existing policy leads. The intern sent me a Slack message asking if we had a formal inclusion statement. I sent her the original, published 3 years ago, linked to our ethics charter, reviewed by 3 external firms. She replied, "Oh, I think we'll just write something fresher." I didn't respond. Instead, I reopened the archive, began annotating the evolution of our people policies. Not defensively, not for show, but because I had already accepted what they hadn't realized yet. That when a system forgets who wrote its rules, the collapse isn't a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. I didn't speak out. I reorganized. There's a difference. Silence can be resignation, but it can also be strategy. In my case, it was structure. I began by rebuilding my access. Not the kind assigned by IT, but the kind sustained by people who remember how you showed up when the systems failed. I spoke with the payroll lead about overlapping eligibility rules in Camille's revised compensation tiers. I didn't frame it as a concern. I framed it as curiosity. He told me quietly that 3 of his team's exception requests had been delayed because no one could locate the new eligibility map. I asked if he had a copy of Camille's source document. He didn't. Neither did compliance. Neither did legal. That was my first checkpoint. I started logging policy deltas, not edits Camille made directly. Those were easy to find, but the ones she triggered through indirect decisions. By eliminating the carryover clause in our sabbatical policy, she had inadvertently nullified a dependent benefits statement in the legacy handbook. She didn't catch it. No one flagged it. But in the metadata of the updated document, I found an entry. Modified by admin CDE, timestamped 3 minutes after Camille's weekly sync with Lena. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't careful. And in systems like ours, carelessness becomes cumulative. I reviewed approval chains, not to challenge them, but to understand which ones had been rerouted. Camille had introduced a new flow for leadership nominations, cutting regional HRBPs out of the first-round filter. On paper, it looked efficient. In practice, it meant that performance history, context only local leads carried, was dropped from early consideration. I reached out to one of our regional managers and asked how the new process was landing. He said it felt thin, rushed, like a checklist designed by someone who wanted to move quickly, not deeply. I took note. The Slack noise continued. Camille launched a channel called Number People Forward, where she posted prompts like, "How do we humanize velocity?" and "Is empathy a metric or a mindset?" Engagement dropped after week 2. She announced a culture mural project using anonymous quotes from exit interviews, many of which were taken out of context. Someone in marketing flagged a misused quote as coming from a post-termination settlement file. Camille took the mural down the next day. No one talked about it, but after that, the channel went quiet. Meanwhile, I reconnected with Helena, not as a whistleblower, but as a systems analyst. We met off site as we'd done years before during a restructuring review. She ordered tea. Jasmine, no sugar. I brought a notebook, printed deltas, and 5 anonymized case comparisons. She read through the first few pages, then looked at me without surprise. It's not negligence, I said. It's inexperience wrapped in confidence. She doesn't know what she's displacing. Helena nodded once. And Lena? I paused. She's betting Camille won't break anything big enough to bring legal into the room. Not yet. Helena closed the file. Then let's make sure we know the difference between disruption and damage. She didn't ask me to escalate. She didn't tell me what to do next. She didn't have to. Because by then, the audit trail was already forming and Camille was already standing at the center of it, smiling, unaware, rewriting processes with borrowed authority. And I was ready to let her continue. I didn't need access to Camille's intentions. I had access to her consequences. From where I sat, quietly, without title inflation or executive Slack handles, I could see the second-order effects she wasn't trained to recognize. One afternoon, I cross-checked the updated onboarding sequence she had drafted. It removed the compliance walkthrough as a standalone module, blending it into a generic culture orientation deck. At first glance, it seemed efficient, but I had written the compliance module. I knew it served as our legal shield for exposure liability. Removing it meant every future employee onboarding would be technically incomplete under our risk protocols. I flagged the metadata, dated it, archived the previous version in a personal folder labeled Structural Divergences. Camille started avoiding me in hallways. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't challenged her once. But systems speak, and somewhere in the corner of her vision, she had begun to sense that the calm around her wasn't consensus. It was surveillance. I never stopped greeting her. I never stopped helping her team when asked. But I stopped volunteering insight. And in a system that was still largely built on my frameworks, insight was often the only thing keeping things from breaking. Camille didn't understand that yet, but she would. Meanwhile, I reopened several dormant case files, issues I had helped resolve years before, where policy gaps had required careful rewrites to prevent litigation. I reviewed the clauses we had fought hardest to keep. One by one, I checked them against Camille's new documentation. 5 had been altered. 3 had been removed entirely. In each case, the digital footprint showed rushed edits, often within minutes of internal meetings where Lena had praised Camille's bias for action. The changes weren't illegal, but they broke protective logic. They removed the buffer between good intentions and legal exposure. They weren't bold, they were brittle. I mapped it all. Not for retaliation, but for reconstruction. Because what Camille was dismantling wasn't my legacy, it was the infrastructure that allowed us to scale ethically. I wasn't afraid she would ruin my work. I was concerned she'd destabilize the company's future without realizing it, and that when it cracked, they would need someone to explain why. So I created a private log. Each entry recorded what policy had been altered, what risk had been introduced, who had signed off or failed to. I didn't accuse, I didn't editorialize, I just annotated. I created a second log. This one was cultural. Every missed signal, every silent deferral, every intern pulled into initiatives without proper onboarding. Every time Camille cited empathy while removing support channels that allowed for anonymous escalation. She talked often about transparency, but transparency without grounding becomes voyeurism. She wanted to surface stories, but she ignored the systems that protected the people in them. And slowly, those people stopped talking. Not in protest, but in self-protection. I saw it clearly, and I kept going. I wasn't building a case. I was preserving a pattern. Because I didn't need to prove Camille's failure. I only needed to ensure that when the fallout arrived, no one could pretend they didn't see it coming. It started with a payroll glitch. A manager in our Northeast office flagged a missing bonus allocation for 2 team members who had hit their quarterly targets. The compensation table Camille had signed off on 3 weeks earlier had adjusted the timing for performance payout disbursement, but failed to update the corresponding cycle in the payroll software. Finance caught it within 48 hours. No funds were lost. No one was publicly blamed. But the mistake triggered a reconciliation review, which traced the error back to an untracked document override, one without compliance notation, One Camille had uploaded herself. It wasn't a scandal. Not yet. It was just a loose thread. But systems remember who pulls first. Next came the anonymous escalation. It didn't go to me. It went directly to ethics, through the formal channel reserved for policy deviation concerns. The message was concise. Policy references used in onboarding orientation do not match legal documentation available on the intranet. Who approves content changes? No names, no accusations, just a procedural question wrapped in a warning. When the ethics officer reached out to confirm ownership of onboarding governance, I redirected her to the most recent documentation Camille had issued. It took one click to see that the approval trail ended with a timestamp and a title. But no name from legal, just Camille's initials. Again, it wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't clean. People began to hesitate. An HR business partner from our central team messaged me one morning with a quiet ask. Can I get the older version of the progressive discipline matrix? The new one skips escalation logic, and I'm not sure it holds under arbitration. I sent it. No commentary, just a file. The next day, 2 more requests arrived, from people I hadn't worked with directly in over a year. Not because they trusted me more, but because they trusted the version of the system that had worked. Camille didn't say anything, but her rhythm changed. She stopped posting thought leadership quotes in the culture channels. She began citing policy review cycles in meetings when asked for specifics. At one point, she reintroduced the old policy repository link in her team's workspace, without acknowledging the retraction she had issued just a month earlier. A quiet backtrack, not a public correction, and the kind of movement that people who understand systems watch closely. Then came the scheduling error. A senior lead in the tech division received an automated reminder to submit their quarterly evaluation. But the template had been changed. The revised form Camille's team had created defaulted all unranked fields to needs improvement. He submitted the form without noticing. His downstream bonus allocation was reduced. He escalated the issue, and legal was looped in. Upon review, the form was found to be non-compliant with performance evaluation standards reviewed by our external auditor last fiscal year. The form had not been validated. It had simply been rebranded. I didn't intervene, but I watched as Camille's name stopped appearing in the CC lines of executive threads. I watched as Lena's public mentions of Camille's initiatives declined. And I watched as the weekly leadership sync, once hosted by Camille with colorful slides and forward-looking statements, was reassigned with a plain subject line, People Strategy Review, Interim Coordination, not a demotion, not a removal, but a shift in posture. The first visible signal that the ground beneath Camille's feet was no longer stable. And no one, not even Camille herself, could pretend not to feel it. The unraveling didn't accelerate. It unfolded, quietly, precisely, like a thread tugged from a sleeve until the whole weave began to shift. The systems didn't collapse. They drifted. Policies started requiring footnotes. Templates came with follow-up questions. Managers began comparing versions of documents in side chats before sending anything official. Camille's initiatives no longer inspired conversation. They invited caution. Her name on a document became a signal to double-check. Not because of malice, because of uncertainty. In leadership structures, uncertainty is the slowest kind of rot. It doesn't scream. It erodes. There was a moment, subtle but clear, when the trust shifted. A director from marketing stopped by my desk after a steering call and asked, "Do you remember which fiscal year we updated the DEI benchmarking criteria?" Camille quoted a stat, but it didn't sound right. I pulled the original deck from my archive and handed it to her. She nodded once, no more words exchanged. The next week, she forwarded me an agenda draft Camille had circulated. No commentary, just the draft, with a highlight on a section titled Redefining Equity Metrics. I returned it with one sentence. This language conflicts with legal disclosure protocols from fiscal year 2021. She thanked me. Nothing else needed to be said. Camille still occupied the same office, still signed her emails with optimism. But there was something different in the tone. Fewer forward-looking statements, more disclaimers, more hedging. Pending legal review. Subject to policy alignment. Initial draft, not final. Her certainty was fraying, not because of confrontation, but because of feedback loops she could no longer control. She had built too quickly, too shallowly, and the structure beneath her no longer absorbed weight. I wasn't the one applying pressure, the weight was coming from the system itself. One Thursday morning, Helena sent me a short message. Have you seen the resignation forecast? I hadn't. She forwarded the internal report. Turnover had spiked in two critical teams, people analytics and org development. Both had reported directly to Camille for 3 months. The feedback collected in exit interviews was indirect but pointed. Lack of clarity in ownership. Misalignment between vision and process. Rapid shifts without consultation. Not one mention of Camille by name. But every line was a fingerprint. Later that day, I passed Camille in the hallway. She was holding a printout, eyes scanning too quickly to be reading. She glanced up, forced a smile, then looked away before I had a chance to return it. I didn't slow down. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. That moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about recognition. Not mine, hers. By that point, several of her key proposals had been paused, pending integration review. The onboarding overhaul had been pulled entirely. The Culture Labs initiative had been reassigned to the communications team. Her weekly newsletter stopped arriving. Her Slack activity dropped. Her name no longer trended in meeting recaps. Even Lena had shifted tone, thanking teams by function, not by leadership. It wasn't erasure, it was quiet displacement. The same method they had once used on me, now replicating itself on the one they had chosen to replace me. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just marked the sequence in my archive, added a new entry in the log, and titled it, Self-Correction in Systems That Still Remember What They Were Built For. Because by then, the unraveling no longer needed my observation. It had become self-sustaining. The collapse didn't begin with a headline. It began with a calendar invite. Plain subject line, no context. People Strategy Review, closed session. Attendees, legal, ethics, risk, and Lena. Camille's name wasn't included. It was the first formal gathering about her work that excluded her entirely. I wasn't on the invite either, but by then I didn't need access to read the direction. I'd seen the indicators line up weeks in advance, the same way one learns to read structural fatigue before a bridge begins to bend. This wasn't a reconsideration, it was a containment protocol. Later that afternoon, 2 of Camille's published policy updates were locked for editing. A message appeared across the system. Restricted, under legal review. That had never happened before. Not in my decade managing governance. Not even during merger integration. Camille must have seen it too, because 15 minutes later, she scheduled an emergency sync with Lena, tagging it, Alignment Touchpoint, Urgent. The meeting lasted 13 minutes. When it ended, Camille didn't return to her office. She walked out of the building, alone. The next day, an audit memo was circulated from legal. It was addressed to senior leadership, outlining concerns over procedural integrity and compliance exposure. It didn't name Camille. It didn't need to. The timeline of decisions matched hers exactly. It called for an immediate pause on all in-flight policy reform, a rollback to previously ratified documents, and the reinstatement of a dual review process before any governance updates could proceed. I read it twice. Slowly. Not to celebrate, but to understand how close the system had come to rupturing completely. Not because of ill intent, but because of unexamined momentum. By Friday, her access had changed. Her publishing rights were suspended. Her Slack handle removed from the workspace owner group. Her bio page taken down from the company site. There was no announcement, no farewell note, no curated exit narrative. Camille simply disappeared from the center. What remained was debris. Unreviewed documents, confused junior analysts, abandoned pilots with no escalation chains, and silence. I stayed quiet too. It wasn't my moment. It was the company's. One it had earned by choosing speed over stewardship. Later that week, I was asked to sit in on a transition huddle, not as a replacement, but as a stabilizer. Someone who could explain what had changed and why it hadn't held. I brought notes. Clear, objective, annotated with context. I made no judgment. I assigned no fault. I just offered the sequence exactly as it had happened. What was changed? What was bypassed? What consequences had unfolded from small, well-meaning edits? They listened. No one spoke over me. No one redirected. They weren't looking for blame. They were looking for a way forward that didn't repeat itself. As I left the room, one of the senior leads followed behind and said quietly, We should have asked you sooner. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, they hadn't just ignored me. They had ignored the structure I built to hold them. And now they finally understood what it had been holding back. By the time Monday arrived, no one expected Camille to return. Her desk remained untouched, a framed quote about transformation still propped beside an unopened notebook. But her name had been removed from all active documents, and Lena's weekly update didn't mention her at all. The silence wasn't accidental, it was calculated. A system trying to reseal its surface before too many questions formed. But the questions were already moving. Not as accusations, but as gaps. The teams that had adopted her frameworks now lacked direction. Pilots she had pushed were on pause. Her presence had vanished, but the consequences of her absence remained. Unstructured, unanswered, and increasingly visible. I was asked to attend a follow-up session with legal and ethics. They didn't position it as an inquiry. They called it a knowledge continuity discussion. But the questions were precise. When did you first notice the procedural inconsistencies? Were the approval chains ever formally bypassed? Was there documentation that highlighted these changes in real time? I answered calmly, without judgment. I brought the archive, provided exact timestamps, side-by-side comparisons, and the full Delta log I had maintained throughout the transition. Helena sat silently in the corner, watching the room. She already knew what the answers were. This wasn't validation. It was closure. After the meeting, I didn't return to my old desk. I went back to the workspace I had quietly relocated to months earlier, tucked behind the HR analytics team, where the only sounds were the quiet clicking of systems being restored. Later that day, Helena messaged me a single line. The board has reviewed the transition report. They'll reach out. I wasn't surprised. The next morning, an invitation appeared in my inbox. Confidential executive briefing, strategic realignment of people systems. The sender was the board's governance committee. Location, off-site, attendees, limited. The language was careful, the subject neutral. But the intent was clear. They didn't want to rebuild Camille's vision. They wanted to understand how to return to something they could trust. At the session, I didn't present a strategy. I presented a map. I showed them what had worked, what had protected the company for years without applause, what had been quietly dismantled, and what could be restored, not as a return to the past, but as a foundation for something more durable. I didn't position myself as the solution. I positioned the structure as the solution, one that required no personal agenda to sustain itself. Just respect for alignment, review, and integrity. At the close of the session, one of the directors asked, "Would you be willing to guide the stabilization phase?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked at Helena. She said nothing, just met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. I turned back to the group. Yes, but I won't rebuild it for visibility. I'll rebuild it for durability, and that means I won't operate alone. They agreed. That afternoon, Lena sent a brief message to the leadership team. Effective immediately, Talia Rivers will serve as Strategic Systems Advisor to the Board and HR Governance Liaison during this realignment period. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't public, but it was the first time since Camille's arrival that my name had appeared in an internal announcement with a mandate attached. I didn't circulate the message. I didn't mention it in any meeting. I simply went back to work. Rebuilding, not to reclaim a title, but to ensure the next person wouldn't have to. The new role didn't come with a title plate. It came with access. Not to dashboards or systems, but to trust. The kind that moves quietly through an organization once it has witnessed collapse and recovery. I didn't sit at the head of any table. I sat beside teams, revisiting the processes Camille had rewritten. Not to restore my version, but to clarify why each piece had once existed and whether it still needed to. We retired some structures, strengthened others, but this time, every revision passed through two lenses, one for compliance and one for context. I didn't reassert authority. I reestablished alignment. The first thing I reinstated wasn't a policy, it was a rhythm. Monthly reflection huddles between legal, HRBPs, and ethics, not just for incidents, but for near misses. I called them review rounds. No minutes, no recording, just notes of what hadn't gone wrong yet and why. At the first session, 5 departments showed up. By the third, there were 12. No mandate had been issued. No incentive offered. People came because they remembered what happened when no one listened until it was too late. I was asked to join the annual board planning retreat as a systems observer, not as an executive, not as a keynote, just as the person in the room who could say, that policy doesn't escalate properly, or that workflow breaks if the approver goes on leave. During one breakout, a board member asked what title I preferred moving forward. I said I didn't. The system I was helping rebuild didn't need names, it needed memory. Outside the company, I received quiet notes from managers who had once worked beside me, from analysts I had helped in passing, from a woman in legal who had joined during Camille's tenure and never understood why so much of what she read felt like a translation from something older, better. They thanked me for being quiet, for not exploding, for leaving something that could be rebuilt. I didn't respond to every message, but I archived them all, not for sentiment, for continuity. Because organizations don't remember integrity unless someone records it. One afternoon, Rima, the intern who had once asked about dignity and policy, came to my desk. She was no longer an intern. She had joined full-time in employee relations. She held a draft of a new escalation protocol. I tried not to over-explain, she said, but I kept your margin notes from last quarter. She smiled. You said process is just policy with memory. I think I finally understand what that means. I looked at her proposal. It wasn't perfect, but it held. The structure was there. And that mattered more than anything. I never moved back into my old office. Someone else sits there now, and that's how it should be. Legacy isn't about returning. It's about building something that doesn't require your name on the door to keep standing. I still walk past that hallway sometimes. Quiet, familiar, unchanged. But I never pause. Because the system I helped rebuild isn't tied to a corner desk or a shared drive. It lives in how decisions are escalated now. How voices that were once rerouted are now recorded. How policy updates are no longer branded as revolutions, but respected as evolution. When Lena resigned, formally for personal reasons, informally under board pressure, I didn't attend the farewell reception. I had a review round with ethics that day, and it mattered more. Camille's name hasn't returned since. She resurfaced briefly in a consulting firm's newsletter, talking about transformation narratives and organizational agility. The article quoted her on reinvention. It didn't mention Crossbridge. It didn't mention systems. I didn't finish reading it. Not out of anger, just irrelevance. At Clevra Holdings, where I now advise in a broader capacity, the pace is different. The stakes are higher, but the principles remain the same. I'm not introduced by title, I'm introduced by impact. Someone once asked why I always carry a leather-bound notebook instead of a tablet. I smiled and said, because some things are worth writing down by hand. What I didn't say was that the notebook contains 3 pages of names. People I've mentored, coached, protected. Not because it's sentimental, because systems don't evolve through slogans. They evolve through stewardship. And that always begins with remembering who held the weight when no one else did. At a leadership offsite, a new director asked what made a system resilient. I told her, when it remembers the quiet people who held the line, not when it celebrates them, but when it builds around what they created so no one has to hold it alone again. She wrote that down. Later, she used it in a presentation. Didn't credit me, and I smiled, because that was the point. One evening, as I left the building, I passed Rima in the lobby. She was walking with a junior colleague, explaining how our performance appeals protocol worked. She used terms I had drafted 4 years earlier. She didn't know that. She just knew it worked, that it held, that it protected. And that, more than anything, was enough. I stepped outside into the early evening light. The air was quiet. No applause, no headlines, just systems in place, people in motion, and the comfort of knowing that nothing needed to be said for the work to remain. Because in the end, that's what legacy is. Not what you take with you, what you leave behind that no one dares to undo.